Um, all right, Esther chapter 3. It's a great chapter. Let's get started. It starts out and says this: after these events. What events? Well, I caught you with that last week because between chapter 1 and chapter 2, it said after these events. And so our common assumption is going to be, well, after the events that took place in the first chapter. However, chapter 1 took place in the third year of King Xerxes' reign there in the citadel of Susa. Chapter 2, 4 years later, took place in the seventh year of King Xerxes' reign. And I told you in the middle of that was an unsuccessful attempt by Persia to take over Greece. And after that, they came back. And so that was actually the events that would have been on King Xerxes' mind as he goes through everything of the second chapter. Well, we get to this third chapter, and it says, after these events. Well, so the question is, what events? Well, in chapter 2, we saw the rise of how God's sovereign hand brought Esther. Hadassah was her Jewish name, but brought Esther into the palace and became the king. And then it ended with something very interesting. It ended with Mordecai there at the gate, and he uncovers a plot that two officials were going to try to assassinate King Xerxes. And so he gets a hold of Queen Esther, and it just so happens that Mordecai now has an in into the throne through Queen Esther. That's how God works. So he talks to Esther, and Esther relays the message to King Xerxes, and everything is found out. And these two guys are punished. They are put to death. Now, you got to just kind of hang on to that for a few chapters, because that's going to come back to play an incredible role in this book. Well, then you get to the third chapter. After these events. Well, be very common to think after the events of chapter 2, until you get over and you find out that this is in the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign. Over in verse 7 of this chapter, it talks about it being in the 12th year of Xerxes' reign. And so, first chapter is in the 3rd year, second chapter in the 7th year, third chapter is in the 12th year of his reign. What happened between the 7th year and the 12th year? Well, we don't know a whole lot. There's not a whole lot of historical things. Most likely, there are historical things, but there weren't anything of major substance that took place for Persia. After you have been defeated like they were with Greece, you spend a lot of time rebuilding, a lot of time restocking your military, your all of your supplies and those type things. And so most likely that was a lot of what was taking place in the citadel of Susa. It was most likely a time of peace, at least to an extent. But one thing we do know is somewhere between chapter 2 and chapter 3, there's a fellow by the name of Haman. And Haman, and I'm going to use this word very, he worms his way, I believe, to where now Haman is the second in command in all of the citadel of Susa. He is the number 2 man behind King Xerxes. And with that, he has an incredible amount of power. And so with that, let's pick up this story. I'm going to start reading in verse 1. I'm not going to give you a lot of information about it, because I got to come back to it, okay? But let's read verses 1 and then go down through verse 4. And what we're going to find is there becomes a clash between Haman and Mordecai. Remember, Mordecai being the uncle / cousin, depending on how you look at it, of Hadassah. He is a Jew. They are, for those of you that weren't here, I'll remind you that these remnant of Jews that are still in the citadel of Susa in the Persian Empire, when Persia took over Babylon, Remember, King Cyrus had issued a decree that they could go home, and there were several deportations. Zerubbabel led the first one with guys like Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, those type people. Ezra led the second one, Ezra and Nehemiah. There's quite a few that goes on with that. Well, there's a group that stayed in not necessarily captivity. They just didn't go back to their homeland. They were no longer captives, and what they did was they assimilated themselves into the Persian culture. Thus, the reason that Esther is not known as Hadassah anymore. She's now known, Hadassah was her Jewish name. She's now known as Esther because that would have been her Persian name. So, with all of that said, let's look at this clash that's about to take place. Verses 1 through 4. It says, after these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than all other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him, but Mordecai would not kneel down and pay honor to him. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, why do you disobey the king's commands? And day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. Let's hang on to that last phrase, by the way. All right, let's talk about what's happening. Haman, now in this 7-year period between chapter 2 and chapter 3, Haman rises up in power. He becomes a very influential man in the citadel of Susa. And because of that, he gathers an incredible amount of pride. And we're going to see as we continue to go throughout the book, the pride, Scripture says, pride cometh before the fall. Haman is an example of pride that cometh before the fall. Haman is a very prideful man. And so Haman kind of enjoys the fact that everybody kind of bows to him. He kind of loves the fact, feels like he's getting some special preferential treatment through the king. He's going to think that for quite a while. And so everybody in the citadel of Susa bows down when Haman comes through, except for this one fella that's sitting at the gate, Mordecai, Queen Esther's family member that had taken her in after her family had passed. Mordecai refuses every single time to bow down to Haman. All of the leaders that are under Haman go and they ask Mordecai why he will not do this. They command him to do it, but he never will. He refuses to bow down to Haman. Now, the question is he just doing it because he doesn't like Haman? Is he doing it because he doesn't, he thinks that Haman's a jerk? And he refuses to bow down to him? Well, the answer to that is really no. Now, we're going to find out that Haman is those things. But why would Mordecai not bow down to Haman? Somebody tell me. Because he was a what? A Jew. And a Jew, according to the Mosaic law, would not bow down to anyone but God. You think of anybody else who refused to bow down to a statue of, a 11-foot tall Nebuchadnezzar and ended up getting thrown in a fiery furnace because of it? Yeah, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Remember, they said every time that the lyres and or the lyres, whatever you want to call them, and the trumpets and all that sound, you're to bow down to this however tall the statue was, and everything happened, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused. They get mad at him. They say, you must bow down. And they said, we will not bow down. And they said, if you don't bow down, we're going to throw you in the furnace. And they said, don't you know that God can save me from this furnace? And then they said something really cool. This is Daniel. They said, but you know what? If God chooses not to save me out of this furnace, we're still not going to bow down to this. Why? Were they just being defiant? No, they're Jews. I shall have no other God before me. And so they refused. And so Mordecai, being the great Jew that he was, refused to bow down to anyone but God. Now, here's one of the questions that I've always had that I don't know the answer to. We know that there was other Jews that were in the citadel. We know that. I wonder if they bowed down. I don't know if Mordecai was the only one or if it's just because Mordecai sat at the gate. Remember, Mordecai would come daily to the gate, and he was coming there secretly to try to check and make sure that everything was going right and well with Queen Esther. So it may have just been the reason that he's pointed out here is because he's the one that's very visual in this. I mean, he is sitting at the king's gate, and every time Haman comes through, he refuses to bow down to him. But there is this clash. Now, I told you to hang on to this last little phrase there. For he had told them he was a Jew. Well, verses 5 through 6, if you just read it on the surface, what you're going to think this is the greatest overreaction that you could ever have. And let's look at it. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Well, you just read through that, and I don't know about you, but on the surface there, I'm going, what a overreaction. First of all, I think it's a very much an overreaction to want to kill Mordecai just because Mordecai refuses to do this. But Haman goes, you know what? I don't want to just kill Mordecai. I want to kill every one of the Jews that are remaining here in the citadel of Susa. We don't know exactly how many that was. There's some estimates out there. But there was a large group of Jews that were still there. And so we asked ourselves the question, why would why would Haman react in such a way? Well, remember I told you we had to come back to verse 1. Let's go back to verse 1 and you're going to find the answer. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, and this next part gives us the answer, and I'll explain it. It says, the Agagite. All right? And we don't have this on the screen because I forgot to tell them that. So flip over to 1 Samuel chapter 15. And let's just read. I'm going to read the entire chapter for you, okay, to make some sense of this. Samuel said to Saul, this is verse 1, just catch up when you get there, okay? Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them and they came up from Egypt. Now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Do not put to death men and women, children, infants, cattle, and sheep, camels, and donkeys. Now, I realize that sounds rough, okay? But what we can say is this. God was very serious. So Saul summoned the men and mustered them to tell him 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 from Judah. Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. Then he said to the Canaanites, go away, leave Amalekites so that I do not destroy you along with them. For you showed kindness to the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. So the Canaanites moved away from the Amalekites. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took, and I want you to pay attention to this, okay? He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all the people he totally destroyed with sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag, and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat, the calves and lambs, everything was good. Everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that despised and weak, they totally destroyed. Now, let me stop. Why is there a problem here? Because God told Saul to destroy everything. He said, destroy the kings. That's why, I told you it's brutal, okay, but he said destroy every animal, destroy everything. And so they go in, and they capture the Amalekites, and they capture the king of Agag, but they refuse to put him to death. They also go and they take all of the fine things that are in the area, and instead of destroying them as God told them to, they keep these things. Well, let's see how God reacts. Then the word of the Lord, this is in verse 10, then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all that night. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, Saul has gone to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone down toward Gilgal. When Samuel reached him, Saul said, the Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. But Samuel said, what then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear? So, he's supposed to have destroyed everything. And when he gets up there, all those sheep and cattle that he had taken he wasn't supposed to, or given away what he had done. Saul answered, the soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest. Enough, Samuel said to Saul. Let me tell you what the Lord told me last night. Tell me, Saul replied. Samuel said, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission, saying, go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? Verse 20, but I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went out on a mission the Lord has assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag the king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. But Samuel replied, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is far better than fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. So let's look what happens. Then Saul said to Samuel, I've sinned, I've violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive me, forgive my sin, come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said to him, I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore. Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. He who is glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a human being that he should change his mind. And Saul replied in verse 30, I've sinned. Please honor me before the elders of the people and before Israel. Come back with me that I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel went back with Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. And then let's look at what happens. Then Samuel said, bring me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And Agag came to him in chains, and he thought, surely the bitterness of death is past. But Samuel said, as your sword has made women childless, so will your mother be childless among women. And Samuel put Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal. Then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to the home of Gibeah, and Saul, until that day he died, he did not go see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him. And the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. So let's think about it. I know that's a lot, but let me draw it in for you. Saul had not done what God had told him to do, and that was that the king of Agag should have been killed. Because of that, God rejects him. We always know the story of how God rejected Saul, and we know that King David will be coming on, okay? But did you notice that Samuel the priest went and fulfilled that which God had told Saul to do? he calls for King Agag, the king of Agag, to be brought forth. They bring the king forward, and Saul kills him. Flip back over to chapter 3, verse 1. Haman the Agagite. Agagites were the descendants of this king that the prophet or that the priest of God had killed there. And so from a very, very, very early age, Agagite children were taught to completely despise Jews. They hated the Jews. I've looked back at some of the things in history and the hatred that the Agagites had for the Jews would have equaled anything that you might even see today. They utterly hated the Jews with everything that they had. Can I remind you of something, by the way? Hatred is taught. It wasn't learned. They were taught to hate this race of people, and they did. And so that kind of explains to us why when Haman realizes that Mordecai is a Jew, and him being an Agagite, and him thinking back to his dad and his granddad and them telling him how horrible the Jews were and how the Jews had killed their king and everything, it's no wonder why Haman, the Agagite, would go and say, well, because he's a Jew, I want every single Jew in the citadel of Susa to be killed. All right, I know that's a lot, but it sets it up for us to understand why this is going on. All right? So now let's look at Haman's plot. Look at verses 7 through 9. Okay? And here's verse 7 tells us the setting of this. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is a lot. This becomes very important. Okay, one of the feast that comes out of everything that takes place in the Book of Esther is the Feast of Purim. It is still observed by the Jews today. And so it becomes important. But a pur is a lot that was cast, okay? And I'll explain in a second. Was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month, and the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all the people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administration for the royal treasurer. All right, well, let's look at what's happening here, okay? There is this lot that is cast. This is something, and I don't understand it completely, okay, but every single year they cast a pur, and then when they cast the pur, it was, from best I could understand, it's basically kind of a superstitious way that they picked a day of the year. And whatever day of the year that pur fell on, it was considered to be that the king should do everything that day that would be in his best interest. Okay? And so Haman takes on the responsibility of saying, all right, well, king, I can tell you what the best interest for you is. What the best interest for you is going to be, let's get rid of these Jews. He doesn't call them the Jews. He just talks about the people. And everything he really says about them is probably true. They are different. Their customs are different. Their worship is very different. And they would refuse to do a lot of the things that the decrees and stuff that the king would have laid down. So most likely a lot of what they said was true about them. But there is this plot. And so the plot falls, and it's actually a year from when this all takes place. And so what Haman is trying to do is to take one full year, and we'll see this in a second, but take one full year and absolutely terrorize the Jewish people, and then at the end of that year, murder them. So going to put them through a year of fear, and he's about to set that into place. And then at the end of that, he's going to have them murdered. So that brings us to verses 10 and 11. Can I encourage you with something? Be cautious who you listen to. Be cautious. You know, Mom used to tell me when I was a kid, not everybody has your best interest at heart. You ever heard that? Be cautious who you listen to. If I could go back and I could say anything to King Xerxes, I would say, King Xerxes, be careful who you listen to. Let's read it. This is verses 10 and 11. So the king took his signet ring from his finger, and he gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Keep the money, the king said to Haman, and do with the people as you please. Let me go back to something that I failed to hit on there. You know, notice at the end of it, because even the king said, keep your money. But I want you to look at how much Haman was willing to invest in order to get the Jews killed. It says in there, he said, if you'll destroy them, I will give 10,000 talents of silver. Do a little research. 10,000 talents of silver equals 375 tons of silver. 750,000 pounds of silver. Hatred runs deep. It really does. And ultimately what Haman was trying to say here is this: I would give everything I have if you'll just kill these Jews. Well, remember I told you, be careful who you listen to. The signet ring of the king was one of the most important things. It was like our president signing something into law. The signet ring was literally a ring that the king would wear, and the insignia of the citadel of Susa, it'd be like the presidential seal, I guess you could have, was imprinted onto that ring. And so the way they did it in those days was they would bring a piece of clay or whatever else, and when a law or a proposal was set before the king, if he wanted to have it done, would take his signet ring and he would stick that into that, and it would leave the imprint of the king there into that. And the interesting thing is this: once it's done, it could not be overturned. There was nobody that could overturn. If the king's signet ring goes into something, it became law. It didn't matter whether you liked it or not, it became law. Well, did you notice what he does? Haman comes to him with this entire story of how these Jews, he doesn't call them Jews, but how these people, they're just so against him, and it's in his best interest if he would just eradicate them. And he comes and he kind of, I see it like they just kind of throw it up on his desk and hoping that the king is going to sign this. And the king takes that ring and he hands it to Haman. And he says, Haman, you do whatever you want to do. Haman takes that ring and seals the fate, for the most part, of the Jews. Why is this a major problem for King Xerxes? Because Queen Esther, without him knowing it, is a Jew. Be careful who you listen to. He takes that ring off. He hands it to him. And he does it. Verses 12 through 15 as we'll close. Poor choices come with huge consequences. Look at 12 through 15. It says, Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province in the language, of each person, all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles and various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own signet ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out. They spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the citadel of Susa was bewildered. You see how this story is just building? You got to be real careful who you listen to. King Xerxes was considered by many to be one of the most wealthy kings of that time. But I will dare say I don't think he was one of the most wise kings of that time. He put his trust and his faith into a man that had very much ulterior motives. And he sent this man out without realizing to kill his own wife. It's a huge plot that's about to come to take place. So 1 year, and we're going to leave it here because we've got to pick it up next week. 1 year from when this was given, when this edict was given, 1 year from then, all the Jews in the entire citadel of Susa found out you're going to be murdered 1 year from today. It was terrorism before we even knew what terrorism was. And the plot of the terrorism was to end by killing every single one of the Jews. Anybody got any questions or comments? It's a good chapter. There's a lot of information there. I don't know. I wondered that myself. I don't know if because of the edict, if they were not allowed to. I don't know how that was, And really, this was their home. This is where they had made their home. So, but I'm not certain. The question was, did some of them flee? And I'm sure there may have been some refugees during this time. I don't know. Esther didn't have that privilege, though. So, yes, ma'am. She grew up Hadassah being her Jewish name, but he did forbid her, especially when she was being called up into the citadel through that whole year process we looked at last time, to not reveal her nationality, and that's where the Esther came up. So my guess is it's one of those things where when she was at home, she was Hadassah, but when she was out in Persia, she was Esther. So. Anybody else? It's a great story. Have any of you went ahead and read ahead? Some of you, good. I love the Book of Esther. Remind you, I've got 5 minutes, so let me remind you, okay? The Book of Esther does not contain the name of God, but it incredibly contains the hand of God. And I want you to to remember and to understand the sovereign hand of God in all of this. All right? If there was not, let's say it like this. If Esther had not become the queen, Mordecai would have never been at the gate to ever hear of what was going to take place to assassinate the king in the first place. If Esther was not in the queen, was not in the kingdom at that point in time, there would have been absolutely no en route for anybody to be able to go in and question the edict that was just put in. I don't think it was I know it was not by chance that Esther won the year-long beauty contest. It was not by chance. That was by the hand of God. And so God was sovereignly at work the whole time working through this. Now, we're going to get into the next chapter, and I'll save it for the next time, but we're going to get in the next chapter, and what I hope you see is the sovereign hand that is right there at work doing some absolutely incredible things. Don't ever forget that God is at work whether we realize it or not. You know, just because I've heard people say, well, I don't feel God. This girl that I was sharing the gospel with this morning, she said, you know, I used to want to feel God, but I never could feel God. And I told her something. I said, you know what? God didn't die so that you could feel him. That's not, you know, God, our relationship with God is not centered on whether we have this feeling or not. Our relationship with God is centered on who he is, not on our feelings. And I think we kind of get into this mindset there like that. But God, just because you may not see God at work, does not mean that God is not at work. In fact, I'll say this. In the times that you don't see God at work, I would even say he's probably working more than you. He may be even working more during those times for you and working things out. So, anybody got anything before we go? Yeah. Well, my guess is she's the only Jew that's there. May have, yeah. It's possible, yeah. I don't know. There's a lot of these underlining things, but that's true. God was just at work, so. Yeah, yeah. A few weeks ago when we watched that movie, before we started this, by the way, I was going to remind you, the very first of that movie, and I should have mentioned this before we got into it, the very first part of that movie, before it even got into the story, was 1 Samuel 15, was what that first part of the movie was. They didn't explain it very well, so you had to kind of understand that, and I should have explained that before the movie. But the first scene that you find there is them killing King Agag, and that's setting up everything with the Agagites. So, go back and watch it. It's on YouTube now. So, anybody? All righty. Let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father God, we love you. We do praise you. We thank you for today. We thank you for your blessings, and we thank you for your word. And God, thank you, God, that we can just break down your word and we can learn. But God, even greater, Lord, as your word says, it never returns void. It accomplishes that which you have designed it and purposed it to accomplish. And God, we praise you for that. And Lord, tonight, you have shown us that regardless of our situation and circumstance, you're at work and you're doing a mighty work. And God, we thank you for that. Lord, I pray as we continue to go through the Book of Esther, I pray that you'll be honored through everything we do and say. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.